Hey everyone, welcome to Real or Fake Tech. We test real versus fake tech and reveal the truth behind gadgets.
Okay, so I've been using the iPhone 17 Pro Max as my only phone for the last 2 weeks, genuinely putting it through everything I normally would. Daily use, travel, gaming, a full camera comparison against last year's model. And there is genuinely one specific thing I found on day 4 of testing that I have not seen a single other review mention yet anywhere, and I genuinely think Apple needs to see this directly. It's not a deal breaker for most people. It's not going to make headline news on its own. But once I show you exactly what's happening and exactly when it happens and exactly how consistently it happens, you are genuinely not going to be able to unsee it either. So stick with me through this entire review because I promise you the payoff at the end is genuinely worth it. This is the iPhone 17 Pro Max, and honestly, there's a lot more going on here than just that one issue. Let's get into all of it properly, section by section. Structure. Here's exactly how we're doing this today. I'm going to walk through design, display, cameras, performance, battery, and software. Exactly like I always do on this channel, giving you my genuinely honest, unfiltered take on each individual section, good and bad, no sugarcoating. But threaded through almost every single section today is that one specific issue I flagged in the hook because it genuinely touches more parts of this phone's overall experience than I initially expected when I first stumbled onto it. By the very end of this video, I'll show you the entire thing laid out clearly and completely, and give you my honest final verdict on whether this is still a phone genuinely worth buying despite it. Let's start properly with the design, because Apple actually changed quite a noticeable amount this specific year. Design. Apple made some genuinely noticeable changes to the overall design language this generation. The camera module on the back is considerably larger than last year's model, stretching almost the entire width of the phone now, which I already know is dividing opinion fairly sharply online before this phone has even really been in most people's hands for a full month yet, having genuinely lived with it for 2 solid weeks now. I actually don't mind it nearly as much as I expected to going in from the leaked renders. It sits flush enough with the rest of the back glass that it doesn't feel nearly as jarring in the hand day to day as it looked purely in early leaked photos. The frame material this year has a genuinely improved grip texture and a noticeably more premium feel in the hand compared to last year's finish. It picks up noticeably fewer visible fingerprints throughout the day. And the anti-reflective coating on the back glass, according to Apple's own claims, is meant to resist scratching considerably better than previous generations too. I've been deliberately carrying it around without any case for the entire 2-week testing period, specifically to properly test that particular claim, and so far, I've picked up a small handful of minor pocket scuffs, but genuinely nothing that catches on a fingernail when I run it across the surface, which is a genuinely good sign this early into ownership. Batuan layout is largely unchanged from last year's model, though the action button and the camera control button both have a very slightly different surface texture. Now that genuinely makes them easier to locate purely by feel without having to glance down at the phone, which is a small, subtle change on paper, but a genuinely thoughtful one in actual daily use. Overall weight is up marginally compared to last year, which is genuinely noticeable if you're switching directly over from the previous model side by side, though after roughly 3 days of regular, normal use, I genuinely stopped consciously noticing it at all. Design verdict. Solid, genuinely iterative, and noticeably more premium feeling in the hand day to day than the leaked photos originally suggested it would be. Nothing revolutionary here, but genuinely nothing worth complaining about either display. The display is, as expected at this point in Apple's product cycle, genuinely excellent across the board. Peak brightness is noticeably higher than last year's already genuinely bright panel, which I properly confirmed by testing both phones side by side outdoors in direct midday sunlight, and the 17 Pro Max's screen remained clearly, comfortably readable throughout, while the older model needed me to actively shield it with my free hand just to see the screen clearly at all. Rate handling continues to be genuinely best in class across the entire industry, scaling smoothly and imperceptibly between 1 and 120 Hz, depending entirely on what's actively displayed on screen at any given moment. And I genuinely cannot detect any stutter or inconsistency at all switching between different apps throughout 2 full weeks of completely normal, regular use. Color accuracy, properly tested using a dedicated colorimeter against a professional calibration target, comes in impressively close to true reference values. Genuinely consistent with what Apple's display panels have reliably delivered across the last several generations, running in a row now the daily verdict. Genuinely one of the single best screens on any phone available right now. Full stop, no caveats. Apple didn't really need to change all that much here this year, and largely, sensibly didn't. Camera system. And the issue, okay, now we finally get properly to it. Camera system on paper here is genuinely impressive across the board. The main sensor is noticeably larger than last year's already strong sensor. The telephoto lens now reaches meaningfully further optically without relying nearly as heavily on digital cropping to get there, and low-light performance across all 3 individual lenses is noticeably, measurably improved in every side-by-side comparison I ran directly against last year's model. Daylight photos are, exactly as you'd reasonably expect from a flagship at this price point, genuinely excellent. Accurate, natural colors, strong dynamic range between shadows and highlights, and sharp fine detail retained even when cropping in significantly after the fact during editing. Portrait mode edge detection has genuinely, noticeably improved to this generation, correctly separating out genuinely fine details like loose, wispy hair strands that previous models would routinely, frustratingly smudge directly into the blurred background. But here's the specific thing I found on day 4 of testing. When you switch between the main lens and the telephoto lens, specifically while actively recording video, not while taking still photos, specifically and only while recording continuous video, there is a genuinely noticeable, completely consistent shift in color temperature and overall exposure that happens over roughly half a second during that exact transition moment. It's not a crash. And it's not a glitch in the traditional sense of the word. The video itself keeps recording perfectly smoothly the entire time, no drop frames, no freezing. But if you watch the resulting footage back afterward, there's a genuinely visible warm-to-cool color shift alongside a brief, noticeable exposure jump happening exactly at the precise moment the lens switch occurs, every single time, completely, reliably reproducible on demand. I tested this specific behavior across more than 30 separate individual clips, deliberately shot in a range of different lighting conditions. Bright outdoor daylight, regular indoor lighting, and low light specifically at dusk. And it genuinely happens consistently in every single one of those clips without exception, though it's most visually obvious and jarring specifically in mixed or warm indoor lighting conditions. I also directly tested it side by side against last year's iPhone Pro Max, recording the exact same subject under the exact same lighting. Switching lenses at the exact same precise moment in both recordings simultaneously, and last year's model handles that identical lens transition completely smoothly, with genuinely no visible color or exposure shift at all anywhere in the clip. To be completely fair and balanced here, this specific issue is genuinely not something that's going to meaningfully matter to the vast majority of everyday people who simply point their phone and shoot casually without deliberately switching lenses mid-recording on purpose. But if you're someone who films any kind of continuous video content professionally and genuinely relies on smooth, seamless lens switching, vloggers specifically, or anyone recording a continuous walkthrough or interview where you'd naturally want to zoom in and out mid-shot, this is a genuinely noticeable, genuinely reproducible step backward compared to last year's behavior, specifically confined to this one narrow but very real scenario. I reached out directly ahead of publishing this video specifically to ask about it, and I genuinely haven't had anything back yet at the time this video is going live, which is completely normal and expected for something this specific and this early after a launch. But given exactly how reproducible this issue is, and exactly how clearly it represents a step back from last year's behavior specifically in this one narrow area, this genuinely feels like something that's fixable with a software update rather than something fundamentally inherent to the new hardware itself. And I genuinely, sincerely hope it gets properly addressed soon. Captain verdict overall. Still a genuinely excellent camera system overall, genuinely among the very best available on any phone today, held back specifically by this one narrow but completely reliably reproducible video lens switching issue that I would genuinely love to see patched in a future software update, performance and gaming. The new chip inside this year's Pro Max is, predictably and reliably, faster across essentially every single benchmark I personally ran compared directly to last year's model, with the most genuinely noticeable real-world gains showing up specifically in sustained, demanding tasks rather than in everyday casual app switching, where honestly last year's phone was already comfortably more than fast enough for the vast majority of people's daily needs. I ran a full 30-minute sustained gaming session using a genuinely demanding, graphically intensive game, carefully monitoring surface temperature throughout the entire session using a dedicated thermal camera. Performance stays admirably, impressively consistent for the first roughly 20 minutes of continuous play, with only a mild, genuinely expected dip in frame rate showing up after that point as the phone actively manages thermal throttling, a noticeably better, more consistent sustained performance profile than last year's model, produced under the exact same identical test conditions, which showed a considerably more pronounced performance dip, starting around the 15-minute mark in my direct side-by-side comparison test. Surface temperature during that same sustained gaming session peaks at a level that's genuinely warm to the touch but never becomes genuinely uncomfortable to continue holding, which is a genuinely meaningful improvement over some of the more aggressive, uncomfortable thermal behavior I've personally seen from certain flagship Android phones running genuinely comparable workloads recently. Performance verdict: genuinely excellent overall, with a meaningfully improved sustained performance profile under heavy, prolonged load compared directly to last year. Exactly what you'd reasonably want and expect from a pro-tier flagship phone at this price point. Battery life across a full 2 weeks of my genuinely normal, everyday daily use. Regular messaging throughout the day, social media browsing, roughly an hour or so of video streaming daily, plus regular camera use specifically for testing purposes, consistently gets me all the way through a full day with somewhere between 20 and 30% battery remaining by the time I actually go to bed at night, which represents a real, genuinely noticeable improvement over last year's model doing the exact same daily routine side by side during an overlap testing period I specifically ran between both phones. Charging speed itself is essentially completely unchanged from last year's model, which is honestly a little disappointing, given exactly how far certain competitors have managed to push wired charging speeds recently in this same general price bracket, though wireless charging speed specifically has received a modest but genuinely welcome bump this particular generation. Battery verdict: a meaningful, genuinely real-world improvement in overall daily longevity, held back slightly by charging speeds that are honestly starting to noticeably fall behind some direct competitors, specifically in this one particular area. Saswithanan. The overall software experience is, as has consistently been the case for several generations running now, genuinely polished and consistent throughout, with a handful of new features introduced this generation feeling genuinely useful in daily practice rather than purely cosmetic window dressing. A couple of small but genuinely welcome improvements to exactly how notifications get grouped together, and a noticeably smarter on-device processing pipeline specifically for the camera app, which actually genuinely connects directly back to that lens switching issue I raised earlier. It does genuinely feel, based on everything else about how consistently and specifically narrow this issue is, like a software-level processing pipeline issue rather than any kind of fundamental hardware limitation, especially given how it only happens during video, only during an active lens switch, and only when directly compared against how smoothly last year's phone handles the exact identical scenario. Software verdict: genuinely strong overall across the board, that one specific camera pipeline quirk standing out as the single clearest, most reproducible rough edge I personally found anywhere across the entire software experience during 2 full weeks of testing. Price and value: starting price is up modestly compared to last year's original launch price, which, when combined with a genuinely strong but largely iterative overall set of improvements this generation, makes the upgrade case considerably stronger, specifically if you're currently coming from a phone that's 3 or more years old, and considerably weaker specifically if you're already using last year's exact model right now. Value verdict: A genuinely strong phone at a genuinely strong, if slightly higher than before, price point. Just genuinely not an urgent upgrade if you already personally own last year's Pro Max model. How it compares to the competition: I spent a few days specifically running this phone directly against the current top Android flagship, back-to-back, on identical tasks, purely to see exactly where things genuinely stand this generation. Display brightness in direct sunlight is genuinely close between both phones, with the iPhone holding a slight but consistently measurable edge in my outdoor testing across multiple days. Daylight photo quality is genuinely close enough that I'd call it a toss-up, depending purely on personal color preference, though the Android flagship's telephoto zoom reaches noticeably further optically before quality starts to meaningfully degrade. Sustained gaming performance, tested using the exact same demanding title on both phones back-to-back, favors the iPhone slightly over a full 30-minute session, with a noticeably smaller frame rate dip toward the end of the test. Charging speed is where the gap is genuinely largest and most noticeable. The Android flagship gets to a full charge in roughly half the time the iPhone takes, plugged into a wall outlet, which remains, honestly, one of the more frustrating areas where Apple continues to lag meaningfully behind the rest of the industry. Comparison verdict: genuinely closer than most headlines will tell you, with each phone clearly, legitimately winning in a few specific, different areas rather than one side sweeping the entire comparison outright. Ecosystem and accessories. A quick word on the broader ecosystem around this phone, because for a lot of people that genuinely factors just as heavily into a purchase decision as the raw specs themselves. The new charging accessory lineup releasing alongside this phone has a couple of genuinely thoughtful additions this year. A slightly redesigned wallet-style magnetic attachment that snaps on with a noticeably stronger, more confident magnetic pull than last year's version, and a new stand accessory that genuinely holds the phone at a more usable angle for video calls specifically. Case compatibility carries over cleanly from expectations. Given the design changes to the camera module, I tested 3 third-party cases from launch day, and all 3 fit properly with no noticeable gaps around that larger camera housing, which isn't always guaranteed in a phone's first few weeks on shelves. Ecosystem verdict: a genuinely solid, thoughtfully considered lineup of first-party accessories and healthy third-party support already in place right from launch. Recap of the MCUSO. Pulling that specific camera issue back together one final time before we properly wrap this whole review up, because I genuinely promised you this right at the very start of the video. Switching lenses specifically during active video recording causes a brief, genuinely visible, completely reproducible shift in both color temperature and overall exposure, happening consistently across every single lighting condition I personally tested, clearly present on this exact new model, and genuinely, completely absent on last year's phone doing the identical side-by-side test. It doesn't crash anything at all, and it doesn't ruin footage outright in any dramatic way, but for anyone who films continuous video content professionally or even semi-professionally, it's a real, genuinely visible step backward in one specific, admittedly narrow use case that I genuinely think deserves a proper software fix sooner rather than later. So, should you actually go and buy the iPhone 17 Pro Max? For the vast majority of people, genuinely yes, the display remains best in class. Both daylight and low-light photo quality are genuinely excellent. Sustained gaming performance is meaningfully improved over last year, and real-world daily battery life is noticeably better too. But if you're someone who specifically records continuous video content and genuinely relies on smooth, seamless lens transitions while filming, that one specific camera pipeline issue is genuinely worth knowing about clearly before you buy. And it's exactly the kind of thing I would genuinely love to see Apple's camera software team take a proper look at and patch soon. Because honestly, everything else about this phone is genuinely excellent enough that this one narrow issue stands out specifically because of exactly how good the rest of the experience genuinely is. If you've personally noticed this exact same thing happening on your own unit, let me know clearly down in the comments below, because genuinely, the more of us that flag it clearly and consistently together, the more likely it is that Apple actually properly looks into fixing it.